on overseas trips, and that encourages them to buy into that particular narrative. Either way, that influences governments, and it influences them to make decisions that are not necessarily what the people of that particular nation want. So the big issue, I think, for us in New Zealand is actually how do we protect our democracy? How do we have a democracy that is truly democratic rather than an elected dictatorship where every 3 years we get to choose someone else to tell us what to do? And I believe actually within nations there needs to be a dilution of power so that the people have a more say in what happens, whether it's through direct democracy like they have in Switzerland, which, I mean, there could be modern variations of that, whether it is simply a binding referenda system where the people have the opportunity to overturn government decision. There has to be some way for a population to hold their government to account. Because without that, you lose your democracy. And we have seen that in New Zealand. The parliamentary protest was a great example of it. And so, yes, large international NGOs can influence government, and then to influence it sometimes for good and sometimes for their own benefit. But they should not be able to without the population agreeing to it, which is what a healthy democracy allows. Smaller NGOs working within a country can make a big difference too. But the thing there is, how does the government make the most of those NGOs? Because again, when an NGO is formed, it's generally formed in a society. It's generally formed by a group that want to make a positive change. They see a need and they want to meet that need within their society. So years ago, I worked for a small non-profit organisation that was getting young people who were disaffected in education. So we'd call them at-risk youth. And the organisation I worked for used the trades to get those young people engaged back in society and in education. And we had a 95% success rate. And that was mainly due to the director of the program, who had a passion for young people, saw the need and met the need that was actually there. The government came along and then decided that for us to be funded, we needed to provide level 3 credits, which is higher intellectual credits for these young people, which is totally the opposite of what they needed. And that destroyed the program and ended it. So a program that had 95% success rate died because the government wanted to control it. Good governance is actually when the government wants to see the people succeed and it's there to serve and not to rule. And I believe the issue we see in New Zealand and in other parts of the world sometimes is governments that want to rule, they're not there to serve. And the idea of serving the people is to see them succeed. So it is less power in individuals and less power in government and more power to the individuals. It is governments actually empowering people to succeed, seeing what people are doing well and supporting it, and instead of trying to control it. And that is across the board, whether it's domestically or internationally. As far as international and policy goes, New Zealand does have a role to play, but New Zealand has to understand its size. And it's right, you work in a true democracy where the people are supported to actually reach their full potential. And we are losing that ability to present that vision when we have an over-controlling government that doesn't recognise individual sovereignty. So the challenge for the world, I believe, is that we don't want large corporations or large international groups having too much influence over individual nations and control over them. Just as the individual in every nation needs to have self-determination of how they operate within their families or within their business or within their communities, so a nation has to have its own self-determination how it operates in its environment. And then it can choose to work with the other groups or other nations that it sees with the same vision. But as soon as one organisation can tell you how to behave, whether it's the International Monetary Fund, whether it's the World Health Organization, whether it's the World Economic Forum, or whether it's United Nations, then you lose your democracy and you lose your ability to actually make free choice. And I think sometimes we think that we can give up freedom for safety, but we end up with neither. And we've seen that actually during the pandemic. And I have had the misfortune of meeting a whole lot of people that have been seriously harmed by the vaccine. And they were not told all the facts about the vaccine before they took it. And now they've taken it, they had to take it to keep their jobs, and now they've taken it, they've lost their health and their jobs. And I agree with Mr. Peters that the situation should have been, you are free to choose. Here's a treatment if you would like it. Here are the negatives that Pfizer themselves had already found that could happen to you, and here are the positives, and allow people free choice. That was taken away from the people, and now there's been massive harm. And in New Zealand, I don't think I've lived in my few short years in a country where there's been less trust of the government than there is right now. And that has happened by the government being dictatorial, saying it's the one source of truth, by saying that we're going to have two tiers of society, and by saying that anyone that disagrees with them is scum. And the last point I want to make is that Mr. Peters mentioned independent media. That is essential, but it has not happened in New Zealand. The media have paid vast amounts of money by the government. I believe there has been ring-fenced. They have had some things they can. I know there are things they have not been allowed to say, and they've all sent the same narrative. And they independent media did live streaming of exactly what was happening on the parliamentary grounds. But New Zealand's mainstream media presented some pictures and a narrative was totally opposite of what people could see themselves was actually happening. And to me, that is a major red flag when you have a media that is doing exactly what the government says, and not one of it will contest the government's narrative. That is a big issue, because then we lose our ability for free speech, we lose freedom, we lose the ability to hear a second narrative, and we lose the ability to make free choice because we're not being given all the choices that are available. So for the world to move forward in an honest way, we do need to have independent free media that are not funded by the government. Media funding could come from the government, but would have to be ring-fenced outside of control of the government, which is not happening. And the government fund media in New Zealand two ways: direct funding, where they actually give them money, and indirect funding in New Zealand, where the government is spending an incredible amount of money on advertising. So, for instance, in New Zealand, the road safety, our roads are appalling. They're falling to bits. They're full of potholes. The government's answer to road safety is a multi-million-dollar advertising campaign to say to people to drive safely. That is indirect funding of the media, because all that money goes to the media and they can use it. So we have direct and indirect funding of the media by the government, who then control the narrative and take the freedom from the people, when actually the wisdom of the people is essential if a government or a nation is to succeed. So I would just like to finish off by saying NGOs have an important part to play, and it can be negative or positive. I think for a positive NGO, the government's role is to support the vision and the passion of that NGO and not to control it. Whereas negative is when NGOs use power, influence, and money to control a few politicians that have too much power, that introduce policies to a nation that that nation doesn't want. And we need to be aware of one and support the other. Thank you.
So much for your critical insights. Was very interesting. So I think that we will have lots of discussions and questions afterwards for sure. But right now I would like to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Kenneth Davis, Program Manager in Defense and Space, Professor and founder of Behavior International Economic Development think tank. And Dr. Kenneth Davis will speak on global civil society opportunities and strengths. So the floor is yours.
Sorry to interrupt again, Vera. Sorry, just for a second,
Yes.
Kenneth. I'm just wanting to extend the invitation to Leighton, because we do have 3 more speakers. Initially, this was going to be a shorter session. Leighton, if you're happy to wait around, we'd love to have questions at the end. How much time do you have served, just out of respect, because we'd like to ask some questions if you have to go early.
I will have to move on at 10:30, so I have another 45 minutes.
So with respect, Vera and Kenneth, would you mind if we just took a few questions, just because we've extended the session by an extra half an hour to accommodate Mr. Peters? Leighton, I just want to say, as a former media man, very exceptional talk. I've really loved what Winston said, and I loved what you had to say better. Thank you for your insights. And how do we tackle this machine? Because we all know that our former Prime Minister, Helen Clark, went off to work to the United Nations and obviously got to the 3rd highest rank. Our Prime Minister has resigned and may have similar desires. And it just seems from what you saw at the parliamentary protests that they seem to be looking for higher position in this world necessarily than serving the people, what they're elected to do. And we do see things like Davos World Economic Forum, where we had our own government represented through Damien O'Connor. They seem to be seeing that there's an opportunity to climb the list internationally rather than serve their people. How do we break that cycle with the way the system is at the moment? To quote one president, the system is rigged.
I think it's an educational thing in some ways. We need to educate the people of New Zealand to the fact that a healthy democracy means that they are represented in Parliament and not that they are ignored for the 3 years once an election takes place. One of my big concerns is sitting beside politicians on stage who say that they have been elected to rule. And that I don't believe that is the case. I believe they've been elected to represent, and it's that mindset of them that are elected to rule which causes an issue. And it's because they have been given too much power. Now, in New Zealand, our bureaucracy has doubled since the year 2000. So in the last 22 years, we have doubled the amount of bureaucrats we have employed in our government. Our population has only increased by 25%. So when you get a very large government, then it wants to control more things. For instance, if you work in government, your pay scale is determined by how many people are working underneath you. So once you work that out, it's very important that you get more people underneath you to increase your pay scale. And that increases the size of government. But then those people come on board, have to justify their existence, and they simply spend more time making more rules for the plebs to actually follow. And that slows down, it actually slows down production. And New Zealand's production rate has been dropping off because we have too many rules to follow, which are developed by people that have to make rules to justify their position paid in the government. So the size of government is a major issue financially and in the way of freedom, but also in control. So I believe we need to present to New Zealand a different vision of what New Zealand could look like, with a decentralised control system where they have more say in their local areas and where the local politicians actually represent them and come back to being servants of the people. So I'd like to present a vision to the people of New Zealand that we have independents standing in the areas whose sole purpose is to represent them in Parliament. They're not under a party whip, they're not under control of a party, because once you're under a party whip and control of the party, you represent the party, not the people. And that's the issue in New Zealand. So we need to get back to representative democracy. We need to get back to candidates that actually pledge to represent the area and not be dictated to by the party. If we can't do that, then we're stuck in the same system of simply someone else grabbing control and forcing the ideology on the nation.
Thank you so much for your answers. I know that we have another question from General Hageman. So I think that
yes. Leighton, thank you very much for your lecture. That was very, very interesting. And I must tell you, this phenomenon, more control and more rules and more regulations, is by far not limited to New Zealand. We can find it throughout. I'd love to say the world, but I don't know the world. But the parts of the world I know, that is absolutely the same. We share this phenomenon. We have more and more control instances. We have more and more rules and regulations, and we have less and less production. And this is something which is probably doable for a certain period of time in well-developed nations and countries, but it cannot last forever. And it influences the responsibility of our citizens, of ourselves, of all of us, and it gives more and more room for suppression and pressure. It's a hard word, I know, and I do not believe that governments and democracies intend to increase suppression and suppression. For sure not. But it goes into this direction, and this is something we have to be aware of. And coming back to your concerns of journalism, yes, what we feel now, at least in Germany and in the European Union, that we have increasing number of articles in our newspapers where the journalists themselves judge very critically their own role through, for example, the pandemic times. And many of them now say, well, yes, we might have followed the position of the government too easily, and we have forgotten a little bit our control function as the power number 4 in a democracy. And this is something we have to bear in mind, because this has certainly not been the last pandemic, and certainly not the last extraordinary situation facing or challenging our systems and our democracies. So this is something we have to keep in mind. And coming back to the NGOs, yes, they play an important role. However, they are at this time also kind of a dangerous instrument in the hands of those who want to take advantage of these social media, especially, where you can create excuse the expression, shitstorm within a couple of minutes and hours, and you can literally destroy those who present a different opinion. To find a balance in this very complex situation is very, very difficult, and I would like to hear more about that from your side, because I very much appreciated what you said earlier. Thank you very much.
Yeah, social media actually plays an important part when your mainstream media are all following the government narrative, because social media or independent media groups growing up on social media allow people to voice their concerns in regards to the media or present another narrative. So it does have a good purpose in some ways, and it definitely can be used negatively, particularly when people throw vitriol or hate without actually balanced reasoning. What we actually need for society to succeed is conversations with people that may not agree with us, but conversations that are based on investigating the issue rather than attacking the personality. And once we start seeing people attack personalities, then the debate is actually dissolved. It doesn't exist anymore because we're not actually looking at the real issue. And I think the maturity of the audience and the maturity of those involved in the media is seen by how they discuss and debate the actual issues. So I think that is how we frame it. And the microscope that we look at it through, is the discussion taking place fact and theory or someone's belief system, or is it simply based on a personality they don't like or simply being negative? So those are really important things, because it's very easy to throw some hate out there against a person, but we need to stop and think, okay, where are they coming from? What is their issue with what is being said? And do they possibly have a point? And they may or may not, but they definitely have a right to say it. And I mean, my thing is, we all have a belief system of sort. Whatever your belief system is, you all have a belief system. And you have a right to share that belief system with others, and they have a right to share their belief system with you. But we don't have a right to force our belief system on others. And what we have seen during this season in New Zealand is a government forcing their belief system on the citizens. That's not right. They had a right to share it, absolutely, but not force it. And they've stepped over the line of sharing to forcing. And that should not happen, and it definitely shouldn't happen within government. The government's role is not to force their belief system on the population. Their role is really to allow that free and open debate of belief systems and support the people to make their choices. But once it starts forcing a belief system, then you're in trouble. And that's where I believe we are in New Zealand. We're in a bit of trouble, and we need to pull it back a bit.
Leighton, could I just sort of piggyback off that by saying, what's your thoughts on Agenda 2030, which is being forced on democracies around the world from organizations like the World Economic Forum, for example? We've seen compromise within China. The Chinese government were having their military trained by the Canadian military, thanks to Mr. Trudeau, and now he's been caught. China were bankrolling him to get into power. So we're not as sound as we would like to think in Western democracy when we're talking about groups like the World Economic Forum and this Agenda 2030. What's your thoughts on that?
that comes back to where NGOs use power, influence, and money to control nations, which is wrong. And the problem you have is when one person in a nation has too much power, like Mr. Trudeau or our previous Prime Minister, there's too much opportunity there for influence and corruption. And it's a human nature thing. So I'm not picking on them as individuals. I'm saying when you as an individual have too much power, too much control, there's too much opportunity for you to be influenced by others, whether it is aimed at your finances or aimed at your ego. You can be controlled and manipulated, and that's why you need to dissolve power so that no one person can be influenced. And I believe what's happened in New Zealand, our Prime Minister was influenced. She put a lot of influence on the 5 ministers under her, and it spread out in a pyramid-like shape, which is why we have the negative situations we see now. And Agenda 2030, so someone has an agenda, they can share it as a vision of what we would like to see the world. But as soon as they start forcing that agenda on, they've stepped over the line. Because if the nations have a choice, and as a nation they say, actually, we don't see that as being beneficial for us, then it shouldn't be forced on them. But as soon as those organisations start using monetary pressure or military pressure to force their agenda on a nation, they've crossed the line. And that rings the alarm bell. That's when nations should actually stop and go, hold on, we're no longer having a choice on this, we're being forced to it, therefore it is wrong simply because it's being forced. So I believe when the United Nations bring out an agenda like that, they can bring it out as a vision of what we think this may be beneficial for the world. But the people in each nation must be able to choose whether they believe it's good for them. Because at the moment in New Zealand, we're having we're the pine tree nation. So our government wants to plant 1 billion pine trees in New Zealand. You can't eat pine cones. And New Zealand is the most efficient nation in the world at producing protein. Our farmers are the most efficient. So if we reduce our protein production, other countries will ramp up theirs. They're not as efficient as ours. Therefore, overall, over the whole planet, it's a negative outcome. And the pine trees, we've just had a massive amount of damage from the slash from pine trees in Cyclone Gabriel, where that slash, which is the offcuts of timber, is washed down and taken out bridges and destroyed land. And also pine trees do destroy the land itself. So those sort of things are where we see a negative outcome from a set agenda that is not discussed or agreed to by the people, but is being forced on by outside influence. And there's plenty of those examples, no doubt. In your countries, you'll see the same, where the choice is taken off the nation and is being influenced by outside influences and forced on them by people with too much power. So disempowering the government and getting it back to its core roles is essential if you want to have a healthy democracy. Thank you very much.
Wonderful insight. Thank you so much. It was really interesting and critical because I think we love to hear such critical insights. I think it's what we need. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much for having me on, and I wish you well for the rest of your conference.
Sure.
Thank you.
Thank you, Leighton.
Okay, so now we should be back to our initial plan. So I'm going to introduce again Dr. Kenna Davis. So Dr. Kenna Davis, Program Manager in Defense and Space, Professor and founder of Behavior International Economic Development Think Tank, has also experience in national security and spent time in 77 countries. It's really impressive. So you will be talking about global civil society opportunities and strengths. So a very interesting topic. So floor is yours, sir.
Can everyone hear me? Wonderful. Thank you. Let me start off with thanking you for inviting me to speak at every chance that you get. That's where you learn the most, and that's where I prefer to spend most of my time. And so I appreciate that. I have just a quick, my background. I spent about a decade in the Marine Corps. I understand the national security side of things. Was in Fallujah in 2004 when we took the city by force. I followed that up with some time in economic development and foreign service work. Work that we had done, and then have spent time up at federal government running the Senate Army Senate Liaison Division, and so we kind of how the laws were made and how that back and forth was going, and would connect back with the Joint Chiefs and the top of big Army. And then I've played at the Office of Secretary of Defense for a number of years, and now run an international think tank. And so and we are currently a nonpartisan. So all these comments and thoughts are mine and my own. They do not represent the U.S. But I do have a number of years, 26 years in the federal government. So I will draw upon that experience. I think that what we have right now in the world of global civil society, there's opportunities, there's things that are working well, and there's things that aren't working well. I like to fall back as an economist, what I refer to as natural tendencies. And natural tendencies are things that have a tendency of happening, whether we want them to or not. And just covering what some of you have already talked about, in policy changes, most often during times of crisis, during times of emergency. And so COVID, most of us didn't have a blueprint on what we were going to do during an event like that. And so we all kind of learned on the fly and kind of figured things out as we were going, with some successes, and I think we all can probably agree quite a few failures along the way. But that's the natural tendency. During a time of crisis, that's when you make the most progress. You move the ball, good, bad, and different. Things change quickly during those times, because when people are getting pushed and pinched, there is passion to get things done, and so the ball moves. What that also means from a policy perspective is that an awful lot of people will prepare a game plan or their blueprint, and they'll sit on the sidelines until something happens that allows them to, what they see in their eyes, make more yards, right? They can run more yards during this time. So if there's here in the U.S., if there's a shooting that matches a certain agenda, then certain people will come out and they've got a blueprint that's already created, and they're going to attempt to run, because that's when they think they can make the most progress. And typically those are true statements. Those are natural tendencies. You got to keep those in mind. Those are the backdrop of what's going on, right? There's also some things that are going on, whether it's technology, but there are some things that are happening, and these are all different degrees in different countries. But at least what we're seeing here is that, we like to brag about free media and free press, and talk about a lot of the importance of free press and free media. But the reality is, if the media isn't asking the tough questions, if the media isn't holding those that make the decisions and the policies accountable, then who is left to do so? For decades and many years, when media was maybe doing more of what we would consider to be their core role, which was asking tough questions and holding everyone accountable, it can be a very efficient and effective tool. When, for whatever means that happens, whether money's coming from one side or another side, or people are looking the other way for whatever reason, when tough questions aren't being asked, then people and policy makers are not held accountable. And when that happens, there's an awful lot of ugliness that can happen quickly. And so we're seeing that all over the place. The other item that you see a lot of right now are college campuses. And again, this is not across all college campuses, but this is a general statement of observation that a lot of colleges, at least here in the U.S., have a significant reduced conversation with others that think differently. Conversation and debate has dramatically diminished over the years, and we're no longer having conversations of, well, why is it that you think the way you do? What is it that you truly believe? Those conversations are almost gone. We want to hear what we already believe, and the reality from an economic or from an education perspective is that you learn the most when you have conversations of discourse, and when you have conversations with those that think differently than you tend to learn more. Whether it's, I didn't realize why you thought what you think, or I hadn't considered some of those items that you are considering or bringing up. But that's typically when a lot of the learning happens, is when there's discourse and everyone's not on the same page. With multimedia and all the tools, we all know it's real easy to block other conversations and like the conversations that support what you already think, and then you get constantly supported with what you already think. But we're losing the education portion, which is when do we learn? When we're uncomfortable and we're forced to have conversations that are slightly different. Now, I'm a trained debate. I love debate. I think debate's important. There's several different types of debate, and I was trained under the method where you had to prepare for both the pro and the con, and then they would flip a coin right before the debate, and you didn't know whether you were going to have the pro, and you didn't know if you were going to have the con, and so it didn't really matter what your opinions were. You had to prepare a strong case for both. And in order to do so, what you typically do is you start learning appreciation for why someone believes one side of an argument versus another side. I think that's a lost art. I think that as we get away from that, we lose a lot of the importance that comes along with understanding and reasoning and calculating. So what are the opportunities? Those, as the natural tendencies are happening, we have the ability to create policy. And there's a couple things that kind of the manner in which policy comes together. So if we're going to talk about global civil society, your international organizations, your international entities that are not focused on one nation state, but are focused on kind of the truistic, what should things be? How could they be? How could we proceed forward are all great and lovely, and those are lovely conversations. But at the end of the day, you still have to take it back to the nation state and go through the sausage press, and you're going to have the different political dynamics inside your own nation state, and you're going to have strikes, and you're going to have all the other entities that are going to apply pressure to the change, right? Whether you are trying a new policy, or whether you're trying to improve a policy, or whether you're trying to reduce policies, or whether you're trying to add policies, right? Those are all nuances of the nation state level, or lower. But there's kind of a core, we're going to talk about real quick, like 7 items of how regulations change and how we can pay attention to those as we have these debates in all these different areas. There's really seven processes that we can take advantage of and think about while we go through these larger conversations that are incredibly important. The first is when you get ready to change a policy, it's what's the policy problem that you're trying to solve, and what is the data that you have? Oftentimes what you find is that some groups are trying to change the problem or the definition because it meets their objective, right? But that's important. That's part of the game. And if you're able to take advantage of that and you're effective with that, then power to you. Then you move your ball further down the line. But the reality is, if you're going to change a policy, you have to pay attention to the data that's there. And I will say, from my time on the Hill, at least on the U.S. side, is that the majority of people that were coming into the offices of the lawmakers, right, are the folks with big lobbies, and the big lobbies have big dollars, and there's a reason why they get the seats and they get the conference time. But all of the players in the offices, both on the left and on the right, loved getting data that wasn't from one of the lobbyists, because they knew that when one lobby comes in, they already know what position they take, and they know what the other lobbies are going to come in with, and they want nonpartisan options in which they can play with, maneuver, and then there's some give and take. And so running an international think tank allows you the opportunity to consider things from a nonpartisan perspective that can help the majority of people when possible. And so the data that you create from an economic think tank, or from any think tank for that matter, internationally or nationally, becomes important, because then that becomes the data in which they can draw upon. Policymakers can draw upon that data. The next item is, what are the objectives? What's the government intervention needing to achieve, and how will success be measured? Oftentimes we don't measure properly, or we don't measure at all, and that creates a very large problem. But if you have something that's measurable, then you can identify whether you're making positive or negative impacts, whether you're moving the ball, whether you're not moving the ball. And so making sure that things are measured are incredibly important. Number 3 is, what policy options are we considering? I can tell you that a lot of times the policies that are made, there's not other options that are considered. It's just this is how we're going to do it because this is the way we are currently in power and this is what we're supposed to do. So we're going to run the ball this way. What's nice when you get to the nonpartisan side, and this is I'm encouraging this to happen beforehand. So between your think tank and our 13 and other think tanks and other academic and other universities, when you have these conversations and you're building the data of what options could be, you're giving the lawmakers, the policymakers, options to consider when they start going. And once they get in that room and they start lobbying, obviously the pressures become very hard and very difficult. And so you've got to have the nonpartisan and the broader options available to them before they are actually start having the conversation, or it's too late, oftentimes. Number 4 is what's the likely net benefit for each option. If you're going to look at options, if you're going to do a regulatory impact analysis, you're going to look at different options. What's the benefit of one? What's the benefit of the other? What's the cost for one? What's the cost for the other? Which has more maintenance costs? What's more upfront costs? What's more back costs? Number 5 is who will you consult and how will you consult them? And this is where I think that academia is falling short. I think think tanks have the opportunity to kind of pick up some of this. And I think that who you bring to the table and when you bring them to the table matters. And so there's a timing issue that's incredibly important. And then number 6 is what is the best option for those you have considered and how will things be implemented? You can have the best policy in the world and you don't implement it properly, and you're going to have problems. And then, of course, number 7 is how will you evaluate your chosen option, and which measurements you're going to use for success. So in that backdrop, I think what we have from a global civil society standpoint is we've got universities that aren't encouraging debate and back and forth, and that's a sad thing from a professor's perspective. I think if you're not going to encourage conversations, then conversations don't take place. And when conversations don't take place, then learning, in my opinion, isn't had. And so that's kind of a dark time. And when you have media can be a wonderful tool. It can be a very efficient tool if it's asking and holding people accountable. And when that's not happening, then the question becomes, who is holding people accountable? Who should be holding people accountable? Who has the power to hold people accountable? I heard you talking about protests. That's one mechanism. That's probably one of the uglier options that are out there, but it has over history shown some positive effects. It also has some negative effects. There's a lot of other options that aren't hopefully as sticky and complex as protests and riots and things. And if we encourage those and promote those, maybe we can have more success. So I would like to just leave it at that. I think that's a little bit of the backdrop. I'm happy to talk about some of these things. I think that everyone makes rules and regulations slightly different, and so I didn't want to get too precise. But I think there's some things that we're all kind of impacting. We're all kind of seeing, and asking some of the larger questions are: what think tanks should be talking to each other? Which universities should be talking to each other? How can we prepare documents and give them to lawmakers before they're needed, so that they can use those in the baking of the cake? You can't give them great recipes after they bake the cake. The cake's baked. Now it's too late. So timing becomes very important, and I think that when we talk about opportunities, think tanks right now, primarily nonpartisan think tanks, is what I'm referring to. Obviously, there's partisan think tanks, but I think those are just going to echo the party lines to whatever the political mechanisms are. I think the nonpartisan think tanks right now, if you're promoting a high level of academia, you want things to be well sourced. You want to be able to identify that there's several different arguments out there. You want to paint what those arguments are. The diplomat in me is always trying to find, let's start off with where we agree, and then we'll build from there, right? So even if you're bringing folks from the other side of the table, which I love to do, I think that's terribly important. There's still things, we all love our kids. We all want to be healthy. We all don't want to lose our net worth because we get sick, right? There's certain things that maybe we can agree on, and then maybe we can build upon some of those items as we talk about some of these policies. But if we don't have those conversations, and the media is not asking the tough questions, and the colleges aren't having the debates, if we, meaning think tanks and academia or built-in academia principles, then who is? And the reality is, and if we don't do that at the think tank level, it's a serious lost opportunity. So I'll leave it at that. And then maybe we've got some questions. I hope I sparked a couple ideas, but I appreciate the time to come and speak. I thank you for my time. I succeed to questions.
So the question will be, would you prefer to answer those questions right now or at the end of our panel?
If I could answer them right now, I would. I've got. I'll leave that with. We can do that now. Then.
Okay, so then we can proceed with questions. So maybe I will start with the first question because to me it's very interesting what you mentioned regarding inclusiveness. And in Gen in Brussels, we speak a lot about comprehensive approach, how to include academia, think tanks, also civil society in regulation and governance issues. So if we think from government perspective, how we can do it? Because to me, I think what is interesting in this dynamics is about how we can include all different actors and understand all different angles and perspectives. So what is your approach on this?
So I take my role as a think tank, a chairman of the board of a think tank, and I was a professor for years and years and years. What you find, one of the powers of a professor is that you have, depending on which institution you're at, 1, 2, 3, 4, 500 young folks that are asking you and looking to you for, what should I study? What should I focus on? What's going to make the best? How do I become the best specialist? I've narrowed it down to these two things. Which do you think would be the most career rewarding, path? There's a lot of power that comes in that, but in the process, the young folks have energy, and young folks have not been beat down by, we've tried this 20 times or 40 times. I've seen this in the 70s, it didn't work. I saw this in the 80s, it didn't work. The young energy of the young folks sometimes is exactly what you need. And, the problem is, who controls the purse strings, right? It's not the young folks, it's the folks that have been around 40, 50, 60 years, and they're putting money in things. And so, and if it's, I don't want to get political, but, if everybody looks the same and has been through the same path, everyone went to Ivy League schools and they're all taught to think the same way, then the answers are going to come out the same. And so how are others getting represented? I've always been a big proponent, and have been for years, and I spent a lot of time over in, I'm a white Caucasian male. I'm not what most would consider to be a feminist. But as an economist, I've spent a lot of time in Muslim countries and in the Middle East. And the reality is when I'm brought to a government table and asked, how can we become economically competitive? And I said, well, that's an easy one. And you're looking around the room, and there's 80 people in the room, and there's 2 American females in the back of the room, and no one else. And the answer is, well, you have to educate women. You have to allow them to be involved in legal contracts. You have to encourage entrepreneurship at the lowest level and at the largest level possible. Because right now you're running a 2-legged race with one leg, and you will be last each and every time until you figure it out. And then what you get in the Middle East is oftentimes you get, well, you don't understand. This is a religious thing. To which I respond, no, you don't understand. Everybody who's successful, who's gone before you, has found a way to set the religious paradigm aside so that the entire economic workforce, the labor force, can be working towards common goals. If everyone's working, you're efficient. And that includes, ironically, all minorities. It doesn't matter what the minorities are. The goal of an efficient economic organization is that everyone's working and everyone's trained and everyone has access to education and all these other things so that everyone can contribute. An efficient labor force means that everyone has, input, and when everyone has input, everyone benefits from the mechanism, right? And so when you have those conversations in rooms where there are no women in the room, the things that I learned from my time were that when you looked across the room of 80 people, everybody over 35 who remembers back when the Russians were in, and they were shaking their head, no, you don't understand, this is a religious thing, it's just not going to change. If you looked around the room, everyone was under 35 was going, well, hey, I went to Pakistan, I went to India, I was educated, I know what it was like. You're right. They're all successful, and they're using their labor force efficiently. So I would argue that some of that is, some of these things that we're seeing here. I don't know how much you guys are seeing on your side, but I think when you use the labor force efficiently, very, very good things happen. I think that right now there's also an awful lot of morphed, righteous, there's a lot of, we're pretending to be inclusive when we're not really inclusive things going on right now. And we're going to take care of this little portion and that little portion, and everybody else around here is going to or owes somebody. You got to set all those little biased and racist and all those other little things aside and say, where does everyone win? When everyone wins, everyone wins. That's the goal. That's literally the concept. And so if you're pushing this group or that group, all you're doing is perpetuating the problem, and it will become tomorrow's obstacle. And so I try to bang that drum oftentimes in certain rooms and certain circles with deft tones. But when you can promote everyone, and when you can promote a situation where it's win-win-win for all those involved, that's when you've got something. That's when you know you're doing it right. I think someone said earlier, if you can't do it saying the truth, then it's you're in the wrong, and that's probably a true statement, right? If you can find a way where everyone's benefiting from the policy, then you're off to the races. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, sure. And I really loved your comments on inclusiveness, women's empowerment, and also questions of diversity, how it is important, and also that we need actually a critical mindset. And I think that is actually essential. So thank you so much for this frank conversation. We appreciate it a lot. So do we have any other questions right now? I think from, General Hageman, yes.
Kenneth, thank you very much. A fascinating lecture and a good insight of what has been said so far. Very, very good. I'd like to come back to the controversial debate you mentioned and you are advocating, which I share without any doubt. Well, all of us intend to stay within our own comfort zone. And to leave the comfort zone is sometimes a bit ugly and difficult. And this leads to the phenomenon, my belief, that we try to share like-minded folks and opinions around us because it makes life easier. But this is contradictory to the controversial debate you are advocating, and which I share. So the comfort zone, the like-minded groups go along with what you already mentioned, the identity policy or identity issue of today, so that people recognize themselves by their identity, regardless what it is, orientation, color, background, education, profession, etc., etc. And if we combine the comfort zone issue, the identity policy, then we face the risk that our societies get more and more diverse and that they do not interact as probably is needed to understand each other better. This is a delicate balance, and we haven't found it yet. So we have a big discussion, at least in Europe, concerning wokeness, concerning identity policy, concerning orientation, and concerning the common spirit of a society. What is remaining as a common spirit of a society? Certainly not only the value of diversity. The value of diversity is not a value as such. The question is what we are doing with that. What is your opinion on that? And could you extend this a little bit more for folks like us? Thank you.
So, great question. I really appreciate it. This is what I've done, and this will be a 4 or 5 minute answer, but I think it's important, and I think I've got a few minutes. So, in my world, in the international think tank, what I have done is I've gained market share by finding individuals that are not getting. These are early professionals typically, who are paying top dollar to go to large universities. And they are spending massive amounts of money. Your mom and dad are spending massive amounts. Someone's, somewhere, or they're going in debt, whatever. But they're going to big universities. They're spending big dollars, and they are not getting what they need from those institutions. Plain and simple, sure. And that's several different fields. We cater to international affairs students. So what I have learned, and I focus them on career progression and get them excited about something that all of them are excited about. Doesn't matter woke, unwoke, left, right. The U.S. is competitive, and so they want to be competitive. But what we found is in the international affairs world, or the soft sciences, so criminal justice, political science, regional studies, economics, all these kind of careers. What we have is, in this, I would consider this to be an academic institution failure. And maybe it's at different degrees. I haven't studied overseas, so I don't know exactly where, but I suspect that it's probably similar. Is that the old joke was, if you can do, then you do, and if you can't, then you teach, right? So there's a little foundation behind that, right? A lot of folks have spent their career teaching and not doing, and so they're not as sharp as some of the folks out there. And there's some schools that like to have folks that do both. I think that's probably a real good a way of staying sharp and still providing benefit to the students. But the reality is, when you go to school in an undergraduate setting, the medical students and the law students, as two examples, typically they identify early. They know that they want to go to law school. They know that they want to go to medical school. They've declared, I'm pre-law, I'm pre-med. They do well in undergraduate school because they have to. It's competitive. They go on and they get their doctorate. Now they've got a terminal degree, and they've got all this other knowledge, and they're in the top 2% of the educated part of the population, and that's all great. And every one of them knows that the day one attorney and the day one doctor are still not going to get paid real paychecks. Not until they have a specialty will they get and earn the paycheck that they deserve. And so they've already got a doctorate degree, and by most other standards, they've succeeded, but they know they're not going to get the paycheck. They're not there yet. They're not across the finish line. And so they all have to work hard. It's 7 to 10 years before you get your specialty, and you can prove to your peers and you can prove to the public that they have a specialty. And once you have a specialty as an economist, the market is happy to pay you what you're worth. If you're a surgeon, if you're an optometrist, or whatever your specialty is, or if you're a patent attorney or a corporate attorney, a divorce attorney, whatever it is, if you've created a specialty and you can prove it, and the peers know it and the public knows it, the market will pay you what you are worth. In the international affairs world, or the political science, or criminal justice, all the soft sciences, what I find is that the passion to create a specialty is almost non-existent. The idea that they need to specialize, somehow we've taught at the collegiate level, I think it's coming from college, or it could be coming from parents, I don't know, or both, is that, I would get folks that would come to me and say, I just went to Georgetown, a great school, and I have a master's in international affairs. And I would say, great, what are you a specialist in? Well, international affairs. And I would go, no, you have a master's. And 40 years ago, having a master's degree might have separated you from, and that might have been constituted, others might have looked at you as having a specialty. In today's day and age, a master's in all things international affairs, think about how funny that is. I see some of you smiling. It's almost comical. So to me, I have to narrow down the concept for them. Look, there's a couple, there's 200 plus countries. There's 2,000 plus languages. there's 10,000 plus policy issues and topics. If you don't have one key area in all three of those columns, then you're not a specialist. You got to have a regional specialty. You got to have a language specialty. You got to have a policy specialty. If you can do that and you spend years cultivating that, publishing and speaking and honing and reading books and talking to others, and now you can prove to the peers and the public that you have a specialty. Trust me when I tell you, people will pay you money because we need specialists. If you're going to stay in the generic world, good luck, $40,000, because you know what everybody else knows, and no one's going to pay you more because you don't bring anything different to the table. And so getting that light bulb to turn on, I gave you all my company secrets, right? But that's the trick. Once that light bulb goes on and they start seeing that is true. Why aren't we we do need to be a specialist. Once that light bulb goes on, now you have them looking down the road and wanting to be a better professional in a nonpartisan academic. I want you to learn the left. I want you to learn the right. I want you to learn how to tell the story in a professional manner. And I always go back to my diplomatic training. You can't go and start the conversation off with, I'm right and you're wrong. Let's sit down and find, that doesn't work, right? You've got to start off with, hey, I understand that we all have different thoughts, but these are the three things I think we can agree on, and build off that. But if you don't have a specialty, if you can find that specialty, and maybe international affairs, that's my lane. Maybe there's other fields that aren't doing that as well. But I think the medical and the legal fields, at least here, have done a good job of conveying to the students and young professionals the need for specialization. I think the international affairs community, the policy community, the political science community, I tell people all the time, you're not gonna go do fishing rights in Japan and then follow that up, in January, and then in March you're going to go down and talk Colombian bean right, or coffee bean rights in Central America, and then you're going to go and talk mining rights in Africa. It doesn't happen. You have to be a specialist. So find what you're excited about, find what you're passionate about, and then start digging in on that. And then from there, and it might take 7 years, 10 years to get a specialty where you can separate yourself. And that might mean taking a job that's not directly in your lane. We still have to pay bills and things, but I don't know. I hope that answers your question. I have found that getting them to focus on their career path and the bigger, broader, longer term thing has allowed me to take advantage of their energy and their passion and their focus, and then giving them, things to do. In order to be a proper specialist, you have to be able to speak the language, write the language, and communicate with everyone. And that's how I do that. Does that answer that question? I hope that wasn't too long.
Thank you so much. It was really insightful, and I agree totally on the point that you cannot be expert in everything. You should actually find your specialty. That is true. So thank you so much. So we will proceed with the next speaker, and it will be John Han, who works for Conggres, New Zealand global charity. And through all career, John has been involved in multiple issues that have impact for women and girls. So that is, I think, very fascinating. So you will be talking about leadership and network in countering human trafficking. So the floor is yours, John.
Thank you so much. Can everyone hear me okay? Yep, good. Firstly, thank you. I feel my knowledge and understanding has been increased so much by the presentations already, and I am very appreciative of being able to profile the work of Hagar to you all today, especially in this context of national and international collaboration and some of the challenges we face in the world today. I think they're going to put up my PowerPoint. Is that correct?
Yeah, just a few seconds, please.
Mm-hmm. Well, I can continue talking. I'm going to follow on from what Dr. Kenneth Davis just said and identify Hagar, the organization I work for, as a specialist in trauma recovery. And we've been working in that space for almost 30 years now of helping women and children who've survived extreme human rights abuse, and the majority of it is around slavery and trafficking. So if we can go to my next slide, please. We talk about the whole journey, and that will become evident as I go through my presentation, starting with people who come absolutely broken from the horror that they have lived, all the way through trauma recovery and out the other side of being empowered, educated, and totally sustainable to live out their lives in safety and to achieve the dreams that they dream and to thrive in their futures. So our overall vision is to create communities that are free and healed from the trauma of slavery, trafficking, and abuse. My next slide, please. I assume that all of you are aware with the updated statistic globally that came out in 2021 that there's an estimated 50 million people enslaved in the world today, which I don't usually like to focus on that statistic because it is horrendous. There are 28 million people in forced labor, 22 million people in forced marriages. And one of our concerns as Hagar is that only 0.2% of these people who've experienced slavery and trafficking have access to services like Hagar's. Next slide, please. So I have already explained what we do. We do this work in Cambodia, Vietnam, Afghanistan, and we are also working in Myanmar and now the Solomon Islands into the Pacific. And I thought one of the best ways to help you understand the depth and broadness of the work that we do, that I will share 3 stories with you. And after each story, I will chat about the vulnerabilities to trafficking, how those vulnerabilities are mitigated, and the challenges in the prevention of these abuses. So I'm going to start with Lynn's story. And I have to warn you that some of these stories are very confronting, but they are representative of hundreds of thousands of young women, children, across nations, across the world. So Lynn did not have a father, and her mother would leave their home every day to find work. They lived in extreme poverty, which means that work was usually enough of an income to possibly survive another day. Very, very subsistence living. And so Lynn didn't go to school, but she would be at home watching her siblings. And one of these issues globally that we have is children being left unprotected in homes. So a neighbor noticed that Lynn, she's just an adolescent, but she's the eldest, so she's watching the children. And so the neighbor sees an opportunity to take advantage of that vulnerability and approaches Lynn and tries to build a friendship and groom her a bit to create a trusting relationship. And as they grew closer, Lynn's neighbor would say, you know that there's a lot of jobs in China where you can make US $100 a month, and think about how you could change your family circumstances, how you could help your mother who works so hard. And so Lynn was thinking about these things, and she decided to take a risk and do this. And so the neighbor had said, "Oh, look, I can help you get there. I'll pay for those expenses for you to get there. And then when you're earning lots of money, you can repay me." And, "Oh, my friend apparently says they will take care of you when you get into China for this job." And so Lynn was supposed to go to an address quite close to her home, but when she got there, she was put into a truck, thrown into the back. She was in darkness. She didn't know where she was going. And when she next saw the light of day, she found herself in China, and she did not arrive at a factory job. Instead, she was sold to a brothel and made to begin servicing customers. So you can imagine the trauma and terror of this child who is now in a country where she doesn't speak the language. She's not where she thought she was going to be. And the horror of realizing that what she thought she was doing this was good is actually going to be very terrible. But there was something in this child that just drove her to believe that there was something better for her life. And she kept trying to escape. And every time she tried, she was beaten. But one time her trafficker got so frustrated with her continued attempts that he took a hammer and broke her kneecap so that she couldn't walk. And over the months that she recovered, and was still working, she did escape, and she managed to walk across the border between China and Vietnam back to her country, because the borders are very porous. And once she got there, she was referred to Hagar. So what Hagar does when they receive someone like Lynn is they take her in, and they, first of all, help her physical presentations of abuse. They start tracing where her family are. They have her in a safe place. They help her with legal support to whether if she can identify her perpetrator. She needs legal papers because she's returned with nothing. She is immediately given psychological and trauma support, and she is assessed so that a treatment plan is made for her. Once Lynn's family was found, which was just her mother, Hagar assessed whether that was a safe place for Lynn to be returned to, and they agreed that it was. And when Lynn's mother found out how the terrible thing that had happened to her daughter, she was like, "Oh, I didn't know that this could happen, and I'm not going to let her migrate for work ever again." But Hagar could tell that the economic stability of the family was not sufficient to keep any of them safe. And so we supported her family with chickens. And so the mother raises chickens now, which provides a stable income that does cover all of their needs. Lynn is receiving Hagar trauma services in her home, and she will now be able to attend school and go as far as she wants or has aptitude to do. For some of our clients, it's reading and writing, and for some, we will support them right through university level. And so Lynn is an example of someone who is at the beginning of their journey of healing. So with Hagar, we just stick with them for doing whatever it takes for as long as it takes until their lives are restored and they are empowered to live a sustainable life. That was a little bit long, so I might have to cut some of my stories out. Okay, so looking at Lynn's story, some of those aspects of vulnerability was that her mother was, I need the next slide, sorry, where you were, that's great. was that her mother, the family just had a solo parent, sometimes even with two parents. Both parents leave the home and may even travel to another province to work, to generate income. So there's the vulnerability of lack of child protection. And I've already mentioned that. And then the desperation of Lynn's life circumstances. So again, I think of life from Lynn's perspective of having nothing, wondering if mom will make enough money to have food tonight. I'm never going to go to school. What will happen to me? What will I be? What is my future? And I think there would be a lot of desperation that would have swayed her to being vulnerable to deception. Challenges to preventing vulnerability in this situation and in many, 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 many situations is the aspect of poverty. There are no jobs, or people are not qualified for the jobs, or natural disasters or wars or other international events create vulnerability among whole populations of people. And in this situation, how easy it is to move across borders unofficially. Mitigating human trafficking. So it depends heavily on national partnerships in the nations that we work in. So training border police to recognize survivors of human trafficking, which often people don't identify, like, oh, I've been I've been trafficked. They know something horrific has happened. They're happy to be back in their country, but they don't understand that this is a global abuse and a very high income generating crime that permeates every country in the world. So being able to identify that so that you can support survivors as they're finding their way or being returned back into their nations of origin. Another mitigation is empowering people from the very minimal level of a daily income, and also for our survivors to be able to support them to the point of education and training that they want to achieve. And that can only really happen after they've had gotten to a certain level of trauma recovery. And without that trauma recovery, people are locked into the behaviors and illness that trauma causes to both the mind and the body and the way that you live. And so Vietnam is a really good example of a country with a lot of modern trauma in its modern history. And without healing of that trauma, you find that the cycle of trauma is perpetuated over generations. So we believe in Hagar that we're stopping that cycle of trauma, and that when people are completely healed of their trauma and empowered, that we are creating resilience in individuals, but we're also contributing to the resilience of those communities to no longer be vulnerable to crimes like human trafficking. Okay. All right, next slide. Thank you. I think I will move on. Let's skip Kanha's story and we'll go straight on to Donna's story. Okay, that might be the next slide. Yeah, thank you. Okay, I'm going to tell you a story about a girl from Cambodia, and she also didn't go to school, and this is due to poverty. Her father was an alcoholic and abusive, so not really the provider for the family. And so she grew up working with her mother as a garbage collector. She was fortunate at the age of 15 that she did get a job in a garment factory in Cambodia, which was able to help her family, but still not enough to negate their vulnerability to trafficking. Now, in this situation, while she was in the garment factory, a coworker built a friendship with her and groomed her and won her trust. And it was very much the same sort of scenario of, you know, if you go overseas to China, you could work in a tea factory and make a lot of money. And actually, I have a friend there, and they say they can put you up, and um, and actually, I will help you get there. I'll just take care of all the arrangements for you. And although, you know, I think another speaker said this, we've grown up in a certain environment. We're like, scam. Yeah, we have the benefit of knowledge and prosperity where we wouldn't be susceptible. So perhaps it is hard for us to understand how a good majority of the world are susceptible and are fighting for basic needs to stay alive, and they want to believe. So anyways, she was transported across the border into China, and very similar to Lynn, she did not arrive at a factory job. Instead, she was presented with the situation of being forced to marry a man in China. And again, you have to imagine the shock of a child that thinks they're doing something good for their family and have been deceived. And so she resisted and refused and probably cried. And her trafficker said, well, what are you going to do? You're in this country illegally. You can't speak the language, and the police will just arrest you and throw you in prison where you'll rot, and then your family won't get any money. And so she felt like she had no choice but to marry this man, and still in the hope that her family was going to receive money from her sacrificing herself. So she did get married to him, and he was very abusive. I'm sure they could not even communicate, but she very soon became pregnant. And then in one of his rages, he took her by the hair and drug her outside and kicked her and hit her with a rock. And she lost that child. She miscarried. And not long after that, her trafficker returned, kidnapped her, and sold her to another man. Eventually, Donna did manage to escape, and like many victims of this crime, they go to the police in those nations where they've been trafficked, but those police are not always the safe place, unfortunately. So she was thrown into a detention center for months where she endured more trauma and abuse until eventually the government returned her into Cambodia. So when she arrived over the border in Cambodia, as I mentioned, we have national partnerships with government organizations, border police, national women's unions, all those entry points or touch points where a victim might surface. And she was referred into Hagar's care. So she was immediately taken to a safe place in Cambodia. It is called the Home of Love, which is meaningful in their language. But that Home of Love is a place where these girls children can come back into Cambodia, sometimes, 100, 200 at a time will arrive in Cambodia from various nations at a time. And Hagar will help to process by giving them safe place to live, again, treating their their physical presentations, and giving them some trauma support and just clothing them and feeding. And there's a house mother in that home that just loves on them. She said that sometimes they just arrive and all they can do is like go upstairs and they just scream. And you can imagine, no, well, I guess we can't. I can't. I tell these stories and I meet these people and I still can't imagine what it's like. Again, the process is we find their family. We see if the family is a safe place for them. Is the community safe? And then we begin to draw up a treatment plan on how she can heal, depending on the level of her trauma, and then look at what does she want from life. Does she want to go to school? Does she want to start a small business? And for Donna, I think her mother and her were given some goats, and she has kind of taken over the running of that little business, and she's been saving money and growing the business, and she's actually quite happy doing that with her mother and supporting her family. Feels very happy and grateful. Do I have a quote from her? No, sorry, I don't have it handy. But you can imagine that their lives are completely changed, and their communities are very much impacted. Sorry, I better go on to the next slide to talk about how we mitigated that. Right. So for Donna, she wasn't going to school. I think that's an aspect of vulnerability. Without educating children, whether they be male, female. I mean, obviously females have less opportunity in the world, but people need an education to be able to have the freedom to make choices and have control over their futures. The hopelessness of her situation. Again, the challenges to preventing vulnerability is the general challenge of poverty and, like I mentioned, international crises that create displacement of huge populations of people. The challenge is that traffickers do groom their victims often and build trust. And that's very hard to prevent unless it's through awareness raising, which we also do. And mitigating human trafficking, there's very practical things. Like in this case, you can see as similar as Lynn's, that people have nothing. They don't have identity papers. They need legal support. They need medical help. They need trauma support. They need to have a safe place to live. And that's why we use that term journey, because with Hagar, it is an intensive, long-term relationship with people. And depending on their response to the abuse they've suffered will depend on their time to achieve that. For some, it may be a year or two. And for others, we've had, for example, Ritti was probably connected with Hagar for almost 20 years, but he is now a medical surgeon in Cambodia. And he works in the main hospital, and he also runs medical clinics in the slums. Okay, if I can have next slide, please. Okay, can someone let me know how much time I have left, because I don't want to overrun my time. Is it about 10 or 15 minutes or less?
I think you have 7 minutes or something like this, I believe.
Thank you. Okay. Okay. So another way that we reduce vulnerabilities to human trafficking is very practical empowerment for women. So this was 2 examples I wanted to show you from Afghanistan, where we've been working right through for many years, right through the Taliban takeover. And currently we are involved in long-term development projects like this, where we help women to be employed. So on the left, you see a sewing enterprise, and on the right, you see a wool spinning enterprise, which in partnership with Afghan businesses, they give the space and the machinery necessary to train women over a 6-month period. They are paid enough income during their 6 months training where they can feed their families, which in Afghanistan is between 8 and 11 normally. And once they've finished that 6-month training, they are then hired on a permanent full-time basis and paid according to what they produce, so their income will rise. Next slide, please. Okay, and we also work at a very, very, very grassroots level. So you can see in the picture in the middle, that's just pulling in local communes, villages coming together and they're just invited to come and learn about child protection, gender-based violence, and talking about human trafficking, which they will all might know exists, but they don't really know how they can avoid it. So that kind of awareness raising. On the left, I think that was from Cambodia, possibly, where we do a lot of training with lawyers, judges, and we've had a lot of influence in the judicial system and how children are processed through that system as witnesses and victims, and how to support children from being re-traumatized during their court proceedings. And on the right, I think these were social workers just coming together in a province in one of the countries we're working in, just to learn more about trauma care and how to use the resources that already exist in the nation for referrals, and how to make that sort of information known within their communities. Next slide, please. Okay, and we also engage in a lot of social media, obviously, because the reach is so great for getting our messages out. And here's a couple of examples. Let's see, on the left there, The Invisible Contract was a movie produced by the Singapore Hagar team about human trafficking as it presents in Singapore. And then in the middle, it's one of our staff, I think, from Vietnam, who is on a radio talk show, also talking about child abuse, child safety, human trafficking, and the same on the right. It was a television interview, also talking about gender-based violence, about being safe, etc. Next slide. And as I said before, as a grassroots level, on the left there, this is a little classroom up on the border in Vietnam and China, just in Yen Bai, and it's just giving children a little bit of awareness about safe migration, about the dangers of human trafficking, and having that information filter back to their families and communities. And it's the same on the right in cities as well. So we do both rural and quite inaccessible rural. So we go quite far. And if we can't get there, then it is broadcast via radio, as I said. And next slide. Okay, and I'm just going to tell you, as far as addressing leadership, I wanted to take the perspective from survivors themselves. Give you two examples. This is Long D. So he was from Cambodia. As a young child, he got polio and lost his legs. So he wears prosthetic legs from his knees down. Because of his vulnerability and because his family were poor, his family did sell him to a trafficker, and he was trafficked to Thailand as a beggar. And so his traffickers made him beg every day for money. And I guess that is quite lucrative, but if he didn't make enough money, they didn't feed him. Eventually, he was trafficked and re-trafficked a few times before he finally came to Hagar. And he went through trauma recovery with Hagar. And on the picture of him on the right is him speaking at the UN in 2021. And I just need to see what that exactly was. It's a very long name. So it was the 2021 appraisal of the UN Plan of Action to Combat Trafficking in Persons. So Long D not only has healed from trauma, but he's just finishing up his master's in clinical psychology. Next slide, please. And then Sophia. The Long D and Sophia are both survivors I've met because they go back in time with Hagar. They're no longer clients. But Sophia's story is one of modern slavery, where her family gave her away at age 4 because they couldn't care for her. She was a slave and passed from family to family and just made to work all day, pretty much treated like an animal. She says of herself that no one even called her by her name. They just called her the ugly one. And this was her reality till she was 12 years old, and she escaped by bicycle. She stole a bicycle one night and pedaled off into the dark. And as Providence would have it, she was stopped by police in another province, and the chief elder in that area knew about Hagar, and she came into Hagar. This little girl didn't talk for a long time, which is a very common response to trauma. But eventually, as she started healing from her trauma, she wanted to go to school. And even at the age of 12 or 13, however she was when she started the schooling component, she was really smart. And she really whipped through her schooling and then wanted to go to uni. And she is now a social worker, qualified social worker, working with girls like herself. And this picture of her on the right is when she was in Australia in 2019. She was flown over by the Australian government to tell her story of slavery to the Australian Parliament committee, who were drafting Australia's Modern Slavery Act. And this young girl, who at one point of her life could not even speak, gave her testimony, and it was televised to millions of people. So I'm very honored to have met Sophia. Yes. Let's move to the next slide, please. And finally, just a quote from one of many, many thousands of women and children that we've worked with. And this is what we do it for, is finally I can do something. I can be successful. I am not useless. Next slide, please. Yes, it's a huge thank you. I did, because of the other presentations, wanted to note a couple of things, which will take me 1 minute. Firstly, by the way, New Zealand does not have a Modern Slavery Act. Number 2, I'm part of a New Zealand coalition of charities that is called the Human Trafficking Research Coalition. And what we do is help fund research and promote research about human trafficking as it impacts New Zealand. And there have been a couple of research projects that have been done. through this network, and you can access those on the website for Human Trafficking Research Coalition for New Zealand. And finally, I know another speaker mentioned this about training. One of Hagar's lofty goals over the next 3 years, we have a partnership with the Deakin University in Australia who want to help us set up a Center for Excellence where we can provide study about trauma recovery, preventing human trafficking, just the whole spectrum of skills and perspective that is necessary to stop this abuse. So thank you again. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jan, for sharing. And it was really emotional and touchy presentation. Thank you so much. It was really very, very important to understand what Hagar does. And of course, you shared some best cases. So I have just one question right now, because I think that it was very interesting what you mentioned regarding different cases and how to also work on awareness. So to me, what I would like to understand in case of Hagar is like, what is the best case if we think about raising awareness? What will be the best mean to do so? Is it through education, training? How you can touch all these vulnerable groups? Because we talk about empowerment of women, but we need also to think about vulnerable groups, and of course there are many. So if we think about your work, and of course there are so many different cases, what will be the best case if we think about, of course, your organization?
Oh, that's a good question. I would say, firstly, for Western countries where trafficking does happen as well, it's using the wonderful resources we have to educate and build awareness. Secondly, within nations that have huge populations of vulnerable people, there needs to be simultaneous working of building the capacity of national professionals and government organizations and structures, as well as having that grassroots, putting it out there to the people that are going to become those victims. So in the long term, building the capacity of these nations, like what Hagar is doing in teaching those that will identify victims and be those that have the best reach and capacity to get those messages to their communities, as well as assisting those nations while they're having that capacity built up by getting out there and initiating those projects and prevention. And a lot of that actually is in partnership with other funding organizations, such as government grants from Western nations, the United Nations, and other big grant-making bodies who want to aid in this respect. And New Zealand government has been one of those as well.
Thank you so much, Jan. Again, thank you for sharing. It was very, very important to understand. Thank you. So we continue with our plan, and right now I would like to introduce our last speaker for this panel is Maxwell Abbott, Managing Director of Asia Pacific Global Foundation. So we all know Maxwell. And of course, he has assisted the community hub to expand, and we all know how he's doing it well. And on top of this, of course, what is interesting in your bio is that you also write poems. So for me, that's a big discovery, because you are also artistic soul, and it is very interesting also to know about it. So you will be talking about New Zealand's free nuclear policy, learning from the past. So floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Vera. Very nice introduction. I I must admit, though, my ambitions of poetry have taken a bit of a dive, because one of my son got me a poem written by a artificial intelligence software, and I thought, gee, I can't better that. So I think I might stick to writing or music or painting, perhaps, for my creative outlet. But thanks for that. Yeah, I'd just like to add too that my perspective today is as a citizen, as a concerned, active citizen, because I think the area that we're addressing has got to be looked at enthusiastically and as a topic that requires self-motivation. So it's true. I'll be talking about nuclear weapons, at least not so much nuclear weapons, but nuclear weapon-free New Zealand, Aotearoa New Zealand. And I want to look at how that came about and how come we've got this zone, this nuclear-free zone in the South Pacific, and what was born from the work and the input that brought this all about for us, because we do all do well to have a nuclear-free world, and to think that it can start in New Zealand is a great thing too. The nuclear-free zone in the Pacific was established. It was the second nuclear-free zone established in the world, and there's quite a few now around the world. But the narrative of this movement goes back really to the end of the Second World War, of course, the dropping of the nuclear bombs on Hiroshima, Nagasaki. The events are etched into New Zealand popular history as being watershed moments in the creation of legislation that announces the total rejection and abhorrence the country has for nuclear weapons. The protests directed at French atmospheric testing at Mururoa Atoll, the dispatching of 2 New Zealand Navy frigates to protest at the tests, the departure of flotillas of New Zealand boats into that same area to be confronted by the French Navy, the sinking of the Greenpeace boat Rainbow Warrior in Auckland Harbour by French agents, the Oxford debate between David Lange of New Zealand and the US evangelist Jerry Falwell, and of course the banning of US naval ships from New Zealand waters. And I might add, it was not just US ships, but it was any nuclear weapon capable boat would be banned. And under current legislation, that's also true, from a ban from New Zealand waters. So these led up to the passing into law in New Zealand of the Nuclear Free Zone Disarmament and Arms Control Act in 1987. But I want to go back now to the start of it, the start of this nuclear horror that was perceived and is perceived worldwide, the Manhattan Project. And of course, the Manhattan Project was responsible for the construction of the atom bomb. After the testing of that bomb near Albuquerque, the scientists that had developed it, around 70 scientists were involved. They wrote to the then US president saying, do not use this. It's a doomsday kind of weapon. It was ignored. Their petition was ignored, and some short time after that, the US Air Force dropped the bomb on Hiroshima and the bomb on Nagasaki. Hundreds of thousands died, around 160,000 died in one, and around 100,000 in another bomb. And just to add perspective, those bombs are minuscule compared with the bombs that are built today. Minuscule, perhaps 1,000 times stronger, the bombs that are in circulation today. And the US has, at the height of the Cold War, they had 15,000 warheads. Russia, similar number. Since the end of the Cold War, they have reduced those numbers. They're still around 7,000. And so we have 5, 6 countries that are nuclear and several others that have bombs but are not condoned by the UN. And of course we have Iran and others, North Korea, still trying to get these weapons. So the New Zealand, the protests in atmospheric testing in the Pacific by New Zealand began. It must be remembered it was grassroots movement. So the protest movement against the nuclear issue was a grassroots movement. It was in conjunction too, and the point that I want to get at in this is that several factors, you could say we got our ducks in a row, and one issue potentiated another. So we had these different issues that culminated in the passing into law of the nuclear-free zone and nuclear-free New Zealand. In 1963, Britain, the US, and Russia stopped their atmospheric testing. China, India, and France continued. France began atmospheric testing at Mururoa Atoll in 1966. Greenpeace vessels protested at the testing, sailing into the test zones. And in 1973, the International Court of Justice ruled against France when taken to the court by New Zealand and Australia. France ignored the ruling and continued testing. New Zealand's Prime Minister, Norman Kirk, sent 2 frigates to Mururoa Atoll with a cabinet minister on board to observe 2 tests. And France eventually moved to underground testing. A very significant, important aspect of this movement towards nuclear-free New Zealand was the Oxford Union debate. That was held in 1985, and of course, David Lange, the New Zealand Prime Minister, was advised not to go, not to take this debate, but he insisted and he went and he won the debate. The proposition was that weapons are morally indefensible. So I'd like to just refer you now to the screen, to some of the comments that David Lange made. And I believe a lot of these are feelings, and a lot of them are strong arguments that are still vital today. And I'd add that the issue doesn't just go away, because we've still got a lot of nuclear threats in the world. And some would say it's growing, the number of threats are growing. So these arguments must be remembered, and the issue must be highlighted. New Zealand has its own nuclear ambassador to the UN, and it must be, I think it was Kissinger said that it must be the priority of the UN to rid the world of the nuclear threat, the threat of the nuclear holocaust. Now, I hope you can see the screen in front of you, the notes. Don't appear to be. Can you make that any bigger, Chibu? Jesse, can you make that full screen at all?
They can see it.
Oh, I see. Okay. So I'll get back to this debate now.
Sorry, is this better?
No, but I can see it, but can you make it bigger on the screen? It's okay. Look, I've got it here, so I'm just going to go read through some of this. This is quoting from David Lange. The character of nuclear weapons is such that their very existence corrupts the best of intentions, that the means, in fact, perverts the end. The best defense which can be made of their existence and the threat of their use, that they are a necessary evil, an abhorrent means to a desirable end. Their character has brought us to the greatest of all perversions, the belief that this evil is necessary. He says that we must go to the ultimate force every time we seek to embark on it, meaning the force of the weapons, of the nuclear weapons, is of course a surrender to the worst of morality. It's the intention which determines the moral character of the action. The character of nuclear weapons is such that it is demonstrably the case that they subvert the best of intentions. A system of defense serves its purpose if it guarantees the security of those it protects. The system of nuclear defense guarantees only insecurity. The means of defense terrorizes as much as the threat of attack. Of course, he was credited also with saying only one thing is worse than being incinerated by your enemies, and that's being incinerated by your friends. He's making the point that there's no escape from a nuclear perspective. Next screen, next slide. Thank you. The weapon has its own relentless inhuman logic. The logic of escalation. The logic of the arms race. Nuclear weapons make us insecure, and to compensate for our insecurity, we build and deploy more nuclear weapons. Yet in the nuclear winter, we will all freeze. It means a total denouement and nonsense as far as any argument in favour of moral purpose. It's a totally unacceptable moral purpose which holds the whole of the world to ransom. There is an assertion that nuclear weapons are the armour of good against evil, evil which cannot be defeated by persuasion or by example, must needs be suppressed by annihilation. Force has not subdued evil. Evil has not accepted annihilation. You can't wholeheartedly support the argument in favour of the superpowers negotiating control of nuclear arms, while nuclear powers embrace the logic of escalation. We've been told here in New Zealand, and remember he's talking about 1985, when the pressure was on. We were being pushed out of ANZUS, the ANZUS Treaty. Now, just a little bit of background about the ANZUS Treaty. After the war, the fear was that the communism was going to come down through Asia into the Pacific. And so Australia, New Zealand, the ANZUS Treaty was formed. And so the pressure was on New Zealand to pull its weight, as they would say, and host these ships that may or may not have nuclear weapons. And the government under Lange had taken the step of saying no nuclear weapons or nuclear capable weapons near New Zealand. He says in his debate, we've been told that because others in the West carry the burden of defence, which terrorises as much as the threat it counters, we too must carry that burden. We in New Zealand must carry that burden. We're actually told that New Zealanders cannot decide for themselves how to defend New Zealand, but are obliged to adopt the methods which others use to defend themselves. This is no humanity in the logic that New Zealand must play host to nuclear weapons because others in the West are playing host to nuclear weapons. That's a logic which refuses to admit that there is any alternative to nuclear weapons when plainly there is. To compel an ally to accept nuclear weapons against their wishes is to take the moral position of totalitarianism, which is exactly the evil we're supposed to be fighting against. The great strength of the West lies not in the force of arms, but it lies in its free and democratic systems of government. Rejecting nuclear weapons is to assert what is human over the evil nature of the weapon. He was quick to add that New Zealand did play its role in defence and defending democracies around the world. I want to just go into a little bit now at the timeline of events. And I know we seem to be running short on time. I'm just going to quickly go over this. In 1951, the ANZUS Treaty was signed. 1963, French announcers there. And, the next slide, please. Chibi, please. Thank you. 1951, the treaty was signed. 63, French announces their intentions to test. New Zealand protested diplomatically. The French ignore it. The French begin their testing, atmospheric testing, 1966. 1972, flotilla of civilian boats sails to Mururoa. 1973, Right Honourable Norman Kirk PM protests to the French. They violated New Zealand rights under international law through the radiation fallout. In 1973, frigate Otago is sent to Mururoa with the Cabinet Minister Coleman Fraser aboard and reporters. Kirk announces the eyes of the world are riveted on Mururoa. The International Court of Justice supports New Zealand calls to halt French tests. The French would not recognise the ruling and proceeded with testing. At the time, a lot of people were asking, well, if these are so safe, why don't you test them in Paris? 1975, of course, the French moved to underground testing at Mururoa Atoll. But the protest continued because the rock underneath the atolls is very fragile, and radiation was going to escape, and so the protests continued. 1985 was the union debate, and the same year, the French foreign intelligence agents sink the Greenpeace flagship Rainbow Warrior, which was about to sail to Mururoa Atoll. And they sink it in New Zealand waters, Auckland Harbour. The first act of state-sponsored terrorism on New Zealand territory. Both the US and Britain refused to condemn the act of France. 1985, 13 Pacific countries signed the Treaty of Rarotonga, otherwise known as the the South Pacific Nuclear Free Zone Treaty, ratified in 1986. 1987, the New Zealand Nuclear Free Disarmament and Arms Control Act becomes law, 1987. 1996, France detonates its final test at Mururoa. France signs a comprehensive test ban treaty after that and has not tested since. Also, 1996, Clinton advises that New Zealand is once again an ally of the United States, no longer a lower ranked friend, but is now an ally, and that continues today. Could I have the next slide, please, Cheesy? Picture map here showing the nuclear free zone in the South Pacific. And next slide, please. And of course, we have Iran wanting nuclear weapons, and the US, which is holding a huge stockpile, is saying, well, why would you want nuclear weapons? Next one, please. And of course, North Korea also, they have their woes, of course, with nuclear missile testing. And it throws a bit of a spanner in the works as far as this person reading the newspaper there. As far as deterrence goes, what happens when you have a number of countries adding to the stockpile and unstable regimes as well, and with less democratic countries, of course, you have the dictator will be the only person in charge of the nuclear weapons. So they're thankful that the deterrence is now safer. Because of deterrence, the world is a safer place now that, of course, North Korea has the bomb. Okay, well, that's mine. If you have questions, we'll have to be quick because my time's up. Thank you, Vera.
Thank you so much, Maxwell. Very interesting and topical presentation, especially as we all talk about war in Ukraine right now, and also how to develop nuclear deterrence. And of course, lessons learned from the past is so crucial. And I think that your presentation is so topical and timely. So as we are running a bit out of time, and we don't have, I think, lots of time, and I don't see any questions here in the chat. Maybe I will just ask very quickly. So what you think is the main lesson learned if we think about, of course, the war in Ukraine and looking at the past and New Zealand's experience and thinking about, of course, effective nuclear deterrence? So what will be the lesson learned from the past, looking at, of course, perspective in the future?
Yeah, thanks for that, Vera. The thing that comes to my mind, as far as the nuclear protests go, is that nuclear-free zones are a very good way to begin. And it was important for me and significant to find that it was New Zealand that was able to stand up to some of the rhetoric of the superpowers and denounce what they were saying as quite untruthful and deceptive. If we think that we're going to be saved by a nuclear weapon, and that was the big thing for me. I understand what's happening in Ukraine. It's a horrible situation. A lot of said, well, because of deterrence, we haven't really had a significant war, and certainly not comparable to First and Second World War, since the beginning of the Cold War. And they're putting that down to perhaps the deterrence. But it does get really tricky when you have other countries, many countries now, with nuclear weapons who deter from who, and what do you need, because you can stockpile weapons against your enemy, but then what happens in other places, and it sort of gets out of hand. It doesn't add up. Deterrence simply really doesn't add up a lot now. But also there's talk of going beyond the threat of nuclear, because there's the cyber aspect of warfare as well, and the fact that a lot of countries will now have logic bombs inside their computers that control their power stations and control their national grids and that sort of thing. So, and they can be controlled by North Korea or by terrorist groups, some other place. So it does get really out of hand. And as far as Ukraine goes, I think Ukraine, the Ukrainian people are suffering a terrible injustice from the war that's being waged against them by Russia right now. It's a terrible thing. But I think too, Vera, with this kind of what happens with people protesting like this, it does get through. It does change things for the better. as we've seen in New Zealand recently with the COVID protests also. Thank you, Vera, very much.
Thank you so much, Maxwell. Thank you for all speakers today. It was amazing and very diverse and interesting, and especially critical presentations were so interesting to follow. And also it was very, very remarkable because we discussed so many different topics, and all, of course, is very critical and important for all of us. So I think that it concludes our first panel right now, since we had all questions, but Brad right now raised a hand. So Brad, I think you wanted to say something.
Yes, thank you, Vera. Just to clarify, we'll restart in an hour and 15 minutes, 1 hour 15 for the second session. That'll be run by Jasmine Retief Nee Murphy, my surname. Okay, we'll look forward to, Jasmine, you controlling the ship for our wonderful 3 speakers for the next episode this afternoon. So look forward to seeing you all then. And thank you to all those who have sacrificed, like Vera, to be up so late at night, and Adrian, good military man, to listen. We know it's not easy, but we thank you for being here.
Thank you so much, and see you then later. Thank you.
Thank you.